My name is Alvin Carpio, and today I'm going to talk about the need really for a new politics given the latest industrial revolution, which is completely shifting the way we live, work and play in societies and economies, and really talk about how we believe that we're on the cusp of those kinds of innovations in politics. As David mentioned, first and foremost, the fourth group is a community, a global community of people in politics and technology. We were set up, well, I guess the story was I'd spent my sort of first decade of my career in social policy as well as in politics, looking at issues of poverty and criminal justice. And back in 2016, I was invited to attend Davos, and being surrounded by all these, nanotechnologists, digital technologists, and people at the forefront of scientific advancement, my mind was blown away, right? In many ways, the future is now, where there is talk of investment in thinking about how we can create immortal human beings. Obviously, more recently, Elon Musk has said he's invested $94 million into a project which will try and create cyborg brains connected to computers. As I said, my mind was blown away. And Klaus Schwab, the chair of the Fourth Industrial Revolution project, in his book, wrote about its impact on societies and economies, but not necessarily politics. So political theories, political activists, political movements. And so that was a big question for me after Davos. And fast forward to Brexit. Brexit, as we've already discussed, has led to many disruptions. And in a way, that was the spark for us setting up something which we call the fourth group. And since Brexit, we've now managed to have just under 2,000 people worldwide looking at these issues. And we have hubs in London, Paris, Berlin, Bogota, Brisbane, and we're hoping next year to reach into the other continents of Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, and North America. And what's wonderful is that we started off with an idea, and now we have people actively contributing to what we've termed political entrepreneurship, really thinking about the big ideas and policies and movements which we can create. So really thinking about how we can have a conversation. What I'll talk about today is three things. First of all, what happened really in the first three industrial revolutions. Secondly, our world today, and then finally a bit about what we do at the fourth group and how we have responded ourselves. So for those of you who don't know, this is kind of a timeline of the previous industrial revolutions. First of all, we had mechanization, secondly, mass production, next computer and automation, and now cyber physical systems, kind of embodied by those, the Internet of Things, as well as the idea of cyborgs. But hark back to those days. I don't know if any of you were alive when this drawing was done. You might be able to tell me a bit more about what was going on there. But the first industrial revolution saw massive changes, not only to our world, but to literally the landscapes of our pastures and our daily livelihoods. And this is a typical image which encapsulates the kinds of changes we saw. And fast forward today, there's a quote which is often sort of said as a joke when talking about this. In the future, we'll have factories, same factories, and they'll be filled with robots, and one human and one dog. And the job of the dog would be to protect the robots, and the job of the human would be to protect and feed the dog. It's this idea that, in the same way we automated many things in the past, we're even reaching a higher, more exponential rate of change where automation might impact the way we perceive our daily lives. But what I really want to get into is to look at the trends during that time. And it's a very long time, end of the 18th to, you could argue the end of the 19th century. And out of this came many new things. And I'm going to talk about ideas, movements, and real change which happened. In terms of new ideas, we had the birth of utilitarianism as an idea, the birth of Marxism as an idea, and the example I'm going to kind of talk about here is Fabianism, the idea of socialism by stealth. And the logo is that tortoise, where it's all about trying to use parliamentary systems to introduce socialism. But what is interesting about the history of the Fabian Society was the fact that out of this society, this group of people who had one common cause came out the London School of Economics. We also saw the creation of the New Statesman, and of course, throughout that time, was very close to the Labour Party in defining how policy and political campaigns and ideas were contributed. So out of this Industrial Revolution, a response were new ideas. And also, we saw new movements. So here is a slightly grainy image of the Chartists. The Chartist movement, which really was about civil society and grassroots communities saying, we want representation, we want the vote, we want to be able to have our say within the current political systems. And we also had the Luddites who came out, obviously the idea of smashing the machines, and we had a lot of reactions to what was happening at the time. And finally, we had sort of, after those ideas, movements, we had real change. This image shows child workers within a factory, and at the time, it was only with the Factory Act of 1833 where we banned children working in factories from the age of 9 and below, and also reduced the number of working hours. So flourishing really of ideas, movements, a response, and political and legal change at the very end. So what kind of things could we learn now that we're in this world where we're even seeing a faster rate of change in what has been termed the fourth industrial revolution? Well, to kind of follow those trends, this is what we believe we are seeing. You know, we've discussed this, I'm sure, in many conversations, and it's always in the media, issues of privacy, virtual reality, the Internet of Things, cyber-physical systems, blockchain, quantum computing, augmented reality, machine learning, robotics. And these are real big changes which many people aren't aware of, and they are very complex things to understand. However, as we know, the World Economic Forum, for example, as a community of business leaders in the main, are really thinking about how this is going to impact their business. The question is, how about civil society? What are we going to do to really be aware of these changes, and how do we respond to them? And there's a question of why should we respond to them? So here are 6 issues which we feel need education about, as well as debate about, and eventually reaction. With new global technological inequalities happening, what are we going to do about it? In one way, we can talk about the amassing of wealth in certain hubs like Silicon Valley, Silicon Roundabout, and other hubs in China. What does that mean, to use a sort of Marxist framework, for the means of production, and what does that mean for us as citizens? And in another way, there's questions around the assumption that everybody has smartphones and everybody has access to the internet, when now there's talks about data being as much of a utility as gas and electricity. So what does it mean when people don't have actually access to those means of getting jobs, often using the internet, for example, means of communication and so forth? What does it mean for new types of inequalities? I won't go too much on automation's impact because it's a oft-told and said debate. There's questions around data protection, ethical considerations of artificial intelligence, social media fake news and echo chambers, and also the legal implications. So I don't know if you heard the story of the drone which nearly crashed into the plane. Did you see that story in BBC News? And it was a question of, okay, who is responsible? Is it the manufacturer of the drone? Is it the owner of the drone? Or is it the drone itself? There are real big questions which even in the UK, the Law Society are really trying to grapple with. So, In the same way, in the first industrial revolution, we had utilitarianism, we had Marxism, we had all of these ideas coming out. The big question is, what is the new guiding set of principles of philosophy which will guide political decision-making and action? We don't have the answer yet, but it is a question that we're trying to think about, and in a way, one of our tasks is to really think about what this type of manifesto or ism might be. Maybe one of you have the answer. We also see new movements already, where this is an image, I don't know if you can see through it. Have you seen this image before, anybody? It's the Deliveroo drivers who are protesting about their wages. And so in the same way we saw the Chartists kind of rising up out of this need for representation, now we're seeing, due to the changes of the labour market and the way business is done, through the gig economy, we have workers using technology, WhatsApp, and all of those kinds of tools to protest against the owners of these technology companies. What will the new type of Chartist or other movements that will arise out of this in response to the other types of problems we've just discussed? And also, I think it was, again, Elon Musk who said this recently, where he called for the outright ban of murderous robots, or robots that have the ability to kill. In the same way where the United Nations was born out of, if you will, war and nuclear threat, do we really need to think about the impact of killer machines, and do we preempt it by banning the production of those machines now? And that's one of those big questions where we're talking about the legislative challenges that we face. Again, that's the image of the fourth group, and what we're trying to do really is encourage this sense of political entrepreneurship, this sense that as a community of people interested in these ideas, what kinds of things do we need to respond from the grassroots global level? This is very early stages. As I said, we've literally been alive for a year, and this is officially my 5th day working full-time for the fourth group. Our big challenge is to think about how we fund such a movement, and that is my big challenge right now, to think about how we actually make something like this a functional and proper funded organization. But already in the last year, we've had some of these outcomes. So one of the new ideas or political philosophies has been termed what we call forwardism. And forwardism is this new idea or concept where for every change or decision around technology and its impact on society, how is it going to forward humanity? So in the same way, when you're asking, should we develop killer drones or not, will that really lead to the progress of humanity today and tomorrow? There's also other questions about whether or not we should allow chips to be in our brains. Will that really lead to the progress of humanity or not? We're at the very embryonic stages of that, but we feel that it's something we want to develop. Secondly is what we're calling the United Citizens. I talked about the United Nations before, and the gentleman there was talking about the birth of political parties, in the 16th century with the Whigs and the Tories fighting through assembly politics. And then we had the birth of a nation, of course, with the United States, and then the United Nations after the Second World War. The big question now is that with access to technology which allows us to organize and communicate instantly, could that level of governance be reduced down to citizens and civil society at a very grassroots level? This is a question that we want to look into in more depth and really think about how we don't organize nations, but we actually organize citizens to respond to these global challenges. And finally, we've done a bit of work around hackathons, and we're thinking about what kinds of campaigns we want to do. So there's questions of positive types of campaigns where we're thinking, okay, is it about bringing internet access to those who don't have internet access, to more thinking about what is the relationship with the big businesses who, as you know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and others, and Apple. What is the relationship there between those users who are us and those who actually own all of our data? Is that fair? Is that right? Do we need to protest? Can we protest because they have all of our data, therefore they can just ruin any campaign that goes against them? Or do we lobby? There's big questions about what kinds of campaigns civil society can bring. And finally, for our hackathons, we've actually, who said it about the end of politicians? You also said that, right? This summer, we held a hackathon to automate politicians. So in the same way, lawyers, doctors, and even board members of venture capital firms are using now machines to make decisions, could we break down the task of a politician from understanding what constituents want to deciding what policy is going to lead to the best outcome? Could we break down those tasks and see how we can automate it through technology? And we had a really fun time, and the winning team called Civic Triage had created a chatbot which effectively would replace MP surgeries. So her whole point is, instead of going to an MP and asking for advice, you use a chatbot, which is your local politician, and they would point you out to the right services, either reducing the time that a politician spends on those kinds of conversations, or collectively, in terms of technology, potentially replacing politicians as we know them today. So that's a bit about the fourth group. Thanks for listening. Hopefully you'll be encouraged to yourselves think about how you can be a political entrepreneur. And to keep in touch, here's all the regular stuff: Facebook, our website, Twitter. Join the discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to create some really powerful ideas that lead to action and hopefully change at the end. Thanks.
Many thanks, Alvin. Hey, David. We're just swapping over the memory disk and the camera.
Okay.
Suddenly it reached its limit. There's a few questions in here. So about your hackathons.
Yeah.
So what's the best outcome of one of the hackathons you've run so far?
Really good question. So hackathons are really good at bringing people together and trying to put through a concept and testing out whether it works. And we really wanted to test out with our first few hackathons whether, if you bring political activists and politicians with technologists, could you create a new and better politics? The first one we held had created a truth feed. So the demo and the technology they created in 2 days was it was a video of David Cameron, and above it was a text overlay stating whether or not he was speaking fact or fiction. And it also had an emoji stating if he was happy or sad, and it was mostly sad. They actually created technology, and the last one we did, as I said, we created Civic Triage, and that team is now trying to sell to citizens advice to try and think about how they can improve their customer service in terms of citizen service for dealing with problems. The big challenge with hackathons is that it's an intense weekend, and often the projects stop afterwards. But when you get a really strong team and a really good idea, you can actually have either an NGO or a company being created out of that. Yeah.
What about the philosophy of forwardism that you mentioned? And maybe you say a bit more than that. And how does it differ from utilitarianism, which is just basically you decide by what's the best, the greatest good for the greatest number?
Yeah.
How is forwardism a fourth generation version of that?
No, it's a great question. And actually, in the initial thinkings, we were simply saying it's like utilitarianism, but with a bit of socialism in it, where you think about the best for humanity, but then also think about those who are worst off. In a way, it's, as I say, at a very early stage, but what we really want to bring is the idea that there is an alternative where we're not, the cheesy phrase we use, we're not left, we're not right, we're forward. So really thinking about when you're making policy decisions, don't stick to those lazy, not necessarily lazy, but to the principles which might not be the best for that particular case, and really think deeply about how it's going to forward humanity, as I say. But at very early stages, and I think the reason why we're saying it now is because of these questions, you know, how can we actually make that a principle which is worthwhile?
Questions from the floor? Yes, there's one here.
So I guess, are there plans then to so if you keep doing these hackathons and you're in different countries or different continents, is there any plan to sort of do some kind of curation of that? So if there are does start to be more success of certain hackathons, certain group kind of like I guess doing something similar to like the alternative, even of kind of pushing something more through that, or so I guess that's probably the main question.
No, it's a good question, and it's the strategic question of how you bring a global community together based on what they're doing as self-organizing communities in their own places, and how do you leverage that to have impact. The long-term vision has always been, I spent my first 3 years working as a community organizer, and I was there during the riot. So we did an inquiry into the Tottenham riots, where we had people who were from the local communities who asked what happened, why it happened, and what can we do about it afterwards. So this was a diverse community working together to try and think about the problems. You right, David? What the problems were, and then come up with an agenda for change. The vision for next year is to say, once we've got those hubs in those different cities, kind of getting the idea and have functional groups in the local areas, we'll co-define an agenda which then we act upon, whether it be through campaigning, lobbying, or online activism. It has to be decided after the priorities are picked, but the aim is to always think about an organised global group. Yeah. Cool.
Can you say a bit about the funding of the fourth group?
Yeah. So I've been running the fourth group with a group of volunteers for the last year, and it reached a point where I was like, if not now, when? And in a way, there was a need for a sense of scarcity and a need to survive, where I decided to quit my job to make this happen. And so currently it's been funded through in-kind support, through some corporate sponsorship. In particular, there's a company who does domain names. And now I'm in a fundraising stage over the next 3 months to think about membership, as well as high net worth individuals giving some backing, and foundations and trusts. So basically that's my big challenge over the next 3 months, to make this a functional and funded organisation. And my ideal would be that we're funded entirely by membership, because we don't necessarily want to be beholden to particular interests. But again, through history, when you look at who funded these previous movements, there's always been that one significant backer from the very start, and it's finding the right backer is the challenge. So yeah.
So Alvin, you talked about the perspective of the fourth group being based on utilitarianism with a dash of socialism. How are you going to capture the dash of entrepreneurship and capitalism that perhaps has created many of the forces that you've referred to in terms of the fourth revolution?
Great question. When we have the right answer to that, we would have changed the world. So in a way, that is the big challenge, where you have an idea, you have an ideal, then you've got to really think in depth how it's what it actually looks like, and then how you're going to influence the world to do it. And we're at very early stages, and there was a tension for me to say, should we actually mention the word forwardism? But actually, by mentioning something like that, you can then see how people respond to it, and I think that's why it's been helpful so far. Yeah.
So, forwards, that's the way to go. I wish I could sell you the idea of humanity plus as the notion and the big idea, which is we're doing this not just for the present situation of humanity, but we're doing it because we envision a better future, a future in which we are all healthier and fitter and smarter, more connected, in which we play more, in which we actually transcend many of the biological constraints and social constraints of the past. But I've already been told off by several speakers and audience members that the word transhumanism is bad. It should be downplayed. Maybe Humanity Plus is a slightly friendlier version of that. Maybe when we talk again in 2 or 3 years' time, some version of Forward or Techno-Progressive or Humanity Plus will be the emerging big idea, which is going to captivate society and make us transcend our present squabbles and transcend our present small-mindedness and seize a better future for all of us. So, Alvin, thank you very much
Thanks
for
so
talking us through this. You've done a bold thing, giving up your job for this. I wish you very best of luck.